Someone had set a pot of coffee too close to the stove flame, and the smell was stronger than it should have been. Sharp, almost burnt. Then it softened as the heat was turned down by an unseen hand. A chair leg scraped once, then was carefully lifted and placed back, as if the sound itself needed permission to exist. The room held its breath around little things. Paper edges being squared, a pencil rolled back to the same groove in the wood, a wristwatch tapped twice against a knuckle to make sure it was still ticking. There was no wind coming through the cracks, but the thin curtain moved anyway, faintly, like a thought that wouldn't settle. It lifted and fell with the same slow rhythm as the man by the doorway shifting his weight from to toe. He did it every few minutes, without looking down, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the wall. Each shift made the leather of his strap creak in the exact same place. A clock hung high enough that no one had to meet anyone else's gaze to check it. The second hand moved with a confident little jerk, louder than it should have been in a room this quiet. It made waiting feel like an activity, like work. When it reached the 12, nothing happened. It simply went past, and the room pretended that was normal. A stack of messages sat on a table, tied with twine, the knot too neat for hands that had been awake too long. Someone had smoothed the top envelope 3 times with the flat of their palm, as if pressure could force better news through the... Another set of fingers, cleaner, with short nails, kept turning a blank page in a ledger, as though the numbers might rearrange themselves out of courtesy. Near the corner, a radio hummed in the way machines hum when they're trying not to be noticed. Every so often it clicked, a small mechanical clearing of the throat, then fell back into its steady, patient buzz. A thin line of static wandered in and out like distant rain. Outside there were voices, but they stayed at a respectful distance from the door. They were not arguing. They were talking the way people talk when they don't want their words to become facts. A laugh flickered once, soft and brief, then died as quickly as it appeared. The laugh didn't fit. It left a shape behind it. A man at the table took off his gloves and laid them down with care, fingertips aligned. He flexed his hands once, then folded them, then unfolded them, then folded them again. Across from him, someone else. No rank visible, no insignia catching the light. Kept a pen poised above the page without letting the tip touch. It hovered, stubbornly suspended, as if ink was an irreversible step. Footsteps approached in the hall. They slowed before the door, stopped, then resumed. The sound moved away, then returned again a minute later, heavier this time, and stopped in the exact same spot. Whoever it was, didn't enter. No handle turned. The pause outside the door felt deliberate, like a test. Inside, no one spoke to fill it. A cup was lifted, sipped, set down. The porcelain rang against the saucer, a clean, brittle note that seemed too bright for the air. Immediately the cup was adjusted, moved a fraction so it would sit perfectly centered, as if perfect placement could keep the moment from tipping. Someone murmured a short phrase, too low to carry, then fell silent. Not a prayer, not quite a plan, more like a reminder given to the room itself, the kind of words that were meant to make everything stay the way it was, for just a little longer. The clock's second hand kept insisting. A thin strip of sunlight shifted across the tabletop, so slowly it might have been imagined. It slid over the tied bundle of messages, then over the waiting pen, then toward the edge, where the wood was worn smooth by years of hands resting there. In the quiet, even the smallest movements began to feel like decision. The hum of the radio thickened for a moment, then steadied as if it too was listening. No one said what they were waiting for, but everyone's eyes kept returning to the same place. An empty space near the door where a person could appear, where a word could arrive, where time could finally stop pretending. And somewhere, just beyond the walls, something that had been gathering without sound was nearly done gathering, because there wasn't much time left. A light behind the curtain brightened, then dimmed again, as if a cloud had crossed the sun. But there were no clouds, not that anyone could swear to, not with certainty. The kind of certainty people liked in the morning was gone by now, replaced with small guesses that sounded reasonable if you said them calmly. The door finally opened without ceremony. No dramatic entrance, no rush of urgency, just the quiet click of a latch and a thin, colder line of air sliding into the... The man who stepped in did not look surprised to find anyone waiting. He carried a folder that had been handled too much, its corners softened and darkened by sweat and repetition. He set it on the table like it was nothing more than paperwork, like it wasn't heavier than the coffee pot, heavier than the clock, heavier than the silence itself. No one stood, no one saluted. They made room for him the way people make room for weather. He didn't start with the folder. He started with routine. He asked if the radio had been working properly, and someone answered yes. He asked if the runner had returned from the post, and someone said not yet. He asked if anyone wanted more coffee. A man who had been staring at the clock said no, too quickly, then corrected himself with a slower no, as if the first one had sounded like fear. The chair scraped again as the new arrival sat. This time, No one lifted it to soften the sound. It scraped the way it always did. A normal sound, a familiar irritation. That, too, was a comfort. Outside the room, the building continued its ordinary life. A pair of boots crossed the hall. A voice called a name, not sharply, not panicked, just the way you'd call someone who was late for their shift. Somewhere further off, metal clinked against metal. The steady business of being ready for something that wasn't here yet. The folder stayed closed while the conversation stayed safe. Someone mentioned the bread at breakfast had been fresher than yesterday's. Someone else replied that it depended on which end of the loaf you. A third voice, older, rougher, remarked that at least there was bread at all, and this drew a quiet agreement that was almost cheerful. The words drifted in circles around the table's center, and never touched it, like moths avoiding a flame they could sense but not see. Then, inevitably, they began to speak about schedules, not strategies, not warnings, just schedule. A shift change at noon, a delivery due in the afternoon, a patrol route that had been altered slightly, nothing serious. Just a small change to avoid a muddy stretch. A note was made in the ledger. The poised pen finally touched the paper, and ink appeared, dark and decisive. That simple mark felt like permission. The day could still be managed. Someone joked, softly, that things always looked worse when you stared at a map too long. The man with the gloves smiled without showing teeth. It was the kind of smile you wore when you wanted your face to look uncomplicated. A radio operator appeared in the doorway to report a message had come through, and the room did not stiffen. It should have, perhaps, but it didn't. The operator's voice was calm, almost bored. A signal received, a confirmation of something small. A unit had reached a checkpoint. The news was delivered like a receipt being handed over a counter. Everyone nodded. The operator left. The latch clicked again. Life remained. For a while, that confirmation fed the room like food. It made the air seem less thin. People leaned back in their chairs. Someone loosened a collar button. Someone else rubbed their eyes with the heel of a hand and then laughed at themselves for being tired, as if fatigue was the only enemy present. The optimism wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the quiet optimism of machinery that had worked yesterday and therefore must work today. The confidence of repeated success. The confidence that grows in places where nothing has gone wrong yet, where the absence of disaster is mistaken for proof that disaster is not coming. And outside, the routine strengthened that illusion. Men moved through corridors carrying crates. A typewriter began its steady clatter in another office, hammering out words that would sound official no matter what they contained. In the yard, someone was running a hose, water hissing and pooling in a shallow trench before disappearing into the ground. Someone else was smoking, holding the cigarette low to hide the ember from any distant eye, even though there was nothing to hide from in the daylight. A bell rang somewhere, sharp, metallic, and no one flinched. It was just the bell. It always rang. It meant lunch would be ready soon. It meant someone had remembered what time it was. Inside the room, the new arrival finally opened the folder. Not all the way, just enough to slide out one sheet, and no dramatic revelation followed. No reaction of horror or shock. The paper sat there, pale and ordinary, and the men around it looked at it with expressions they might have used for any document. One of them adjusted the sheet so it aligned perfectly with the table's edge. Another leaned closer, squinting at a line as if it were merely difficult to read. The conversation that followed stayed measured. Words like likely, possible, and within expectations drifted across the surface. Someone pointed out that the figures were still within acceptable margin. Someone else said the numbers could be interpreted differently. A third voice suggested that if there was any trouble, it would be minor and brief, the kind of trouble you could correct with a little discipline and a few more hours of work. No one called it what it felt like. No one said, "This is the moment." They spoke as though time itself was cooperative, as though it could be negotiated, and because they spoke that way, they began to believe it. Even the man by the doorway, still shifting from heel to toe, seemed to settle, his movements growing less frequent. He glanced at the clock less often. The second hand kept marching, but it no longer sounded like an accusation. It sounded like a familiar background noise, the ticking of a world that was still under control. A runner finally arrived, breath steady, face not flushed. He handed over a message, and the man with the folder read it, nodded once and said, "Good, good, just that." The words spread through the room like warmth. Chairs creaked as shoulders loosened. Someone poured fresh coffee, the stream steady, the cup filling without spilling. Someone mentioned that once the afternoon passed, the rest of the day would be easier. Someone else agreed, saying the worst was behind, meaning the waiting, the uncertainty, the strain of not knowing when the next piece would fall into place. They were so close to comfort they didn't notice how fragile it was. Outside, the sunlight kept sliding, slow and indifferent, across the yard and the road beyond it. Far away, too far to identify, too far to demand attention, something made a sound that could have been thunder, or a distant engine, or nothing at all. No one paused to listen long enough to decide. The room kept talking, the building kept working, the day kept pretending it was just a day, and all the while, the space between now and whatever came next kept shrinking, quietly, politely, like a door that closes without anyone hearing the latch. The first thing that went wrong was so small, it didn't even earn the word wrong. It was a pause. The radio hummed, then stopped humming for a fraction longer than usual before the sound returned, slightly altered, as if it had cleared its throat. The operator adjusted a dial, frowned at nothing in particular, then leaned back again. Machines did that sometimes. Everyone knew that. The hum resumed its patient rhythm, and the moment passed without comment. Outside, the hose in the yard sputtered once, coughing air before water flowed again. The man holding it lifted the nozzle, shook it, and went back to spraying dust from the concrete. The puddle widened, then seeped away, leaving a darker stain that would dry before anyone noticed it had been there at all. Inside the room, a chair leg caught briefly on a groove in the floor. The man sitting in it shifted, freed it, and apologized out of habit. No one responded. The apology wasn't necessary. Nothing had happened. The sheet of paper on the table was turned slightly, rotated a few degrees so the numbers faced another pair of eyes. Those eyes traced the lines carefully, slowly, the way you read when you're looking for reassurance rather than information. A fingertip tapped once beside a column, then moved on. The tap went unanswered. Someone remarked that the air felt heavier than earlier. Someone else said it always did around this hour. Heat rising, walls holding it in, a normal thing. They agreed on that, and the comment was forgotten as soon as it landed. Another message came through the radio, not an alert, just an update. The operator read it aloud in a neutral voice, the kind trained to flatten. A unit had adjusted its position slightly. No reason given, none requested. The man with the folder nodded and said nothing. The message was logged. Ink dried on paper. A younger voice asked if the adjustment would affect timing. Not significant, came the reply. It was delivered with confidence that did not feel rehearsed. It felt inherited. The younger voice accepted it. Everyone. The clock advanced. The second hand reached the 12 again, and again nothing happened. The room had learned by now that this was how things worked. Time moved. People waited. The world stayed intact. In the corridor, a pair of men argued quietly about something unrelated. Supper, perhaps, or a missing tool. Their voices rose just enough to be recognizable as disagreement, then fell back into something closer to humor. One of them laughed, sharper this time, and slapped the wall lightly with his palm. The sound echoed once, then dissolved. A glance flickered toward the door. No one mentioned it. The man by the doorway shifted his weight again, heel to toe, toe to heel. His strap creaked. He adjusted it, tugging the leather so the sound changed pitch, then resumed his watch. His eyes lingered on the empty space beyond the door a little longer than before, then moved away. Another sheet was pulled from the folder. This one had creases that suggested it had been folded and unfolded many times, perhaps by different hands. The creases were smoothed out, pressed flat, as if erasing evidence of indecision. Someone pointed at a line and said it looked off by a small margin. Someone else leaned in, squinted, and said it depended on how you read it. It's within tolerance, the older voice said. Not dismissive, calm, final. The line was accepted back into tolerance. A runner passed the open doorway without stopping, boots striking the floor in a rhythm that didn't match anyone else's pace. He looked inside briefly, made eye contact with no one, and kept going. His presence left behind a sense of movement that the room did not follow. The radio hummed again. The static thickened, thinned, thickened once more. The operator's fingers hovered near the controls, then relaxed. If he was uneasy, it stayed behind his eyes. Someone mentioned the weather. Clear, stable, favorable. The word favorable hung in the air longer than it needed to, like it wanted acknowledgement. It received nods. A note was made in the ledger about timing, written small, neat, and careful not to crowd the margins. The pen paused at the end of the line, hesitated, then lifted without adding anything else. The empty space after the sentence remained empty. Outside, the bell rang again. Lunch. A reminder that the body still needed ordinary things. A reminder that this moment was still connected to all the moments that came before it. Someone commented that they should eat before it got cold. Someone else said there would be time. Time was the one thing no one thought to check. Another message arrived, delayed, but not late enough to sound an alarm. The wording was vague, a phrase that could mean several things depending on tone. It was read aloud, then read again, more slowly. The second reading carried a faint question at the end, barely audible. "It's nothing," someone said. Not sharply, not defensively, just reflexively. The phrase settled like dust. The message was set aside, placed atop the others, aligned carefully. Its edges disappeared into the stack. Conversation resumed its gentle drift. Someone talked about a past operation that had seemed uncertain at the time and turned out fine. Someone else added a detail, then another. until the memory grew smoother, more confident than it had ever been in reality. The story ended with a shrug, proof that worry was often wasted effort. The room absorbed the lesson gratefully. No one noticed that the radio had gone quiet again, not completely, just enough that the hum was thinner, strained. No one noticed that the sunlight had reached the very edge of the table now, a bright line that seemed to stop there, unwilling to cross. Far away, something made a sound again, longer this time, more deliberate. It could still be ignored. It was still distant enough to be ambiguous. And ambiguity, everyone agreed without saying it, was not the same thing as danger, so they ignored it. They adjusted papers. They finished coffee. They waited. And with each overlooked pause, each softened irregularity, the invisible weight pressing toward the room grew heavier, quietly. While no one found a reason strong enough to stand up and name it, the room grew smaller without any, not physically. No walls shifted, no ceiling lowered, but the air seemed to draw inward, tightening around objects, around people, around the narrow space where nothing being said. Sounds became more deliberate. Each movement carried a faint echo, as if the building itself had begun listening more closely. Someone checked the clock again. This time, they didn't pretend it was casual. The second hand was still steady, still confident, but the minutes around it felt compressed, stacked closer together than before. Noon had passed. That mattered, though no one explained why. Someone remarked on it anyway, just to hear the fact spoken aloud. Noon. The word landed flat, harmless. Noon happened every day. The radio clicked, not the usual soft mechanical sound, but a sharper interruption, brief and insistent. The operator straightened, fingers already moving before his thoughts caught up. Static surged, retreated, surged again. A voice tried to break through, fractured, uneven, like it was being pulled apart and stitched back together in real time. Say again, the operator said calmly, too calmly. He adjusted the dial by a hair's width. The voice returned, clearer now, but still in. A sentence began, stalled, then resumed somewhere else. The message had gaps, the kind that made listeners fill them in without realizing they were doing it. The operator wrote something down. He paused halfway through the line, then continued, choosing a different word than the one he'd started with. When he finished, he read it aloud. No one reacted immediately. The man with the folder leaned forward, elbows on the table now, posture no longer relaxed but not yet alarmed. He asked a question that sounded procedural, clarifying, responsible. The operator answered with what he had, which wasn't much. The answer ended with a phrase that suggested uncertainty without naming it. That's normal, someone said, almost gently. Reception's always worse around this time. No one argued. Another voice suggested waiting for confirmation. Another agreed. Waiting had worked so far. Waiting was familiar. Waiting didn't require anyone to be wrong yet. Outside, footsteps approached faster than before, then slowed abruptly near the door, as if whoever carried them had reconsidered. The handle turned halfway, stopped, then turned fully. A man stepped in, helmet tucked under one arm, hair damp with sweat. He did not look panicked. He looked focused, which was worse. He delivered his report standing, not because he was rushed, but because sitting would have felt inappropriate. The report was brief, observational. He described what he had seen without interpretation, without urgency, just facts, positions, distances, timing. His words were clean and orderly, arranged so they wouldn't bump into each other. When he finished, silence took its place carefully. The man with the folder asked one question, just one. The answer came slower this time. Not because the speaker was unsure, but because the truth required more careful handling. A glance moved around the table, not a look of fear, more like an inventory. Who was here? Who was listening? Who would remember what was said next? Someone cleared their throat and pointed out that adjustments could still be made, small ones, nothing drastic, a matter of timing or coordination. There was still room to maneuver. The phrase room to maneuver sounded good. It suggested control. Someone else added that altering anything now might introduce confusion. Procedures existed for a reason. Changing them too close to execution, if execution was even the right word, could cause mistakes. Mistakes were more frightening than whatever hadn't arrived yet. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The operator didn't wait for the voice to speak. He leaned in, listening hard, pencil frozen above the page. The voice came through in fragments, breathless, but not shouting. A location was mentioned, then another, then a phrase that didn't quite fit with what had been said earlier. The operator looked up. He did not speak immediately. That delay, only a second, maybe less, was noticed by everyone. He read the message, carefully, exactly as received. When he finished, he waited, as if expecting correction from the room itself. No one corrected him. A discussion began that wasn't quite a discussion, more like a series of overlapping reassurances. Interpretations offered gently, like hands extended without force. The message could mean this, or that, or nothing at all really, once you accounted for variable, weather, terrain, human error. Human error was always someone else's. The man standing by the door, still standing, shifted his weight again, but this time he didn't return to his original position. He took half a step forward, then stopped, as if crossing an invisible line he hadn't been aware of before. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. No one asked him to speak. Someone suggested a short delay, not a halt, just a delay, to gather more information, to be thorough. Thoroughness sounded responsible. Someone else countered that delays had consequences too. Windows closed, opportunities passed. The balance tipped back and forth, gently, politely, like a pendulum that refused to settle. The clock kept ticking. A pen was lifted, hovered, lowered back to the table without touching paper. Outside, the yard had gone quiet. The hose was off. The men who had been moving crates were no longer visible through the window. Even the distant voices had faded. The stillness pressed closer now, no longer content to remain outside the walls. The folder was closed. Not slammed, not snapped shut, just closed, decisively, with a soft sound that carried farther than it should have. "We proceed as planned," the man said. It wasn't an order. It wasn't announced. It was stated the way you state the time when someone asks. A fact, a continuation, a refusal to complicate the moment further. No one objected. Someone nodded. Someone else exhaled slowly, as if relieved to have something solid to hold on to again. The man by the door stepped back into his old position, heel to toe, the familiar rhythm returning like a comfort. The radio hummed. The clock advanced. The window, the one that had never been named, was still open, but it was closing. It did not feel like a decision. That was the first thing about it, how little it resembled one. No raised voices, no signatures demanded in haste, no moment anyone would later point to and say, "There." What happened next was smaller than that, quieter, almost courteous. The operator reached out and adjusted the radio frequency by a fraction, just enough to stabilize the signal. He did it the same way he always did, muscle memory guiding his hand. The hum deepened, steadied, and locked into place. A thin line of static vanished. It felt like improvement. No one noticed that the adjustment narrowed what could be heard. Outside the room, a message runner changed direction at the end of the corridor, following a routine route instead of the shorter one he had taken earlier. The choice saved a few seconds in one place and cost them in another, but it evened out, balanced, reasonable. He did not know that the shorter route would soon be blocked, not completely, just enough to matter. Inside, the ledger was closed. Not dramatically, just closed. The way you close a book you expect to open again later. The pen was placed on top of it, parallel to the spine. Someone straightened it without thinking, aligning it with the edge of the table. Order restored. A chair scraped as a man stood, pushing it back with his foot. He stretched his shoulders once, rolled his neck, then left the room to attend to something ordinary, something he had done 100 times before. The door closed behind him, sealing the room with a soft, final sound. The clock marked another minute. Someone asked if there was any word from the forward position. The operator shook his head. Not yet. The phrase carried no urgency. Not yet implied soon. Soon implied control. A second radio channel crackled briefly, then went quiet. The operator glanced at it, hesitated, then returned his attention to the primary frequency. One channel was enough. Too much information created noise. Noise created mistakes. That thought passed through the room without being spoken. Outside, a vehicle engine turned over, hesitated, then caught. The sound settled into a steady idle. Someone leaned against the hood, waiting for instructions that would arrive when they always did. The exhaust drifted upward and disappeared into the warm air. A distant signal light, barely visible from the window, shifted color. The change was subtle. It did not announce itself. Anyone watching would have needed a reason to keep their eyes fixed there. No one was watching. Inside, a man checked his watch and said, "We're on schedule." The word "on" mattered. It suggested alignment, precision, that whatever had been anticipated was still obedient to the plan. Another man replied, "Good," and meant it. The radio spoke again. This time, the voice came through clearly, too clearly. There was no static to soften it, no distortion to excuse misunderstanding. The message was short, a confirmation of movement, of readiness, of something being set into motion exactly as intended. The operator wrote it down. He paused at the end of the line, pen hovering, then added a single word in smaller letters, a modifier, not a warning, just a clarification. The ink dried almost instantly. When he read the message aloud, no one interrupted him. No one suggested a change. The room accepted the words the way it had accepted everything else that day, as part of a sequence already in progress. Outside, the engine revved once, then settled. Boots struck pavement in unison. 2 sets, then more. A gate opened somewhere, metal against metal, then closed again. The sound echoed briefly and vanished. Inside, the radio operator reached for his cup, found it empty, and set it aside without refilling it. He did not realize why he no longer felt thirsty. The man by the doorway stopped shifting his weight. He stood still now, eyes fixed on the empty space beyond the door, posture rigid not from fear, but from recognition. His mouth tightened. He did not speak. Whatever he understood had arrived too quietly to justify words. The clock ticked. The light through the window no longer moved across the table. It had reached a place where it stayed, somewhere beyond the walls, far enough to still be dismissed, close enough to already matter. Something aligned with something else. Not violently, not suddenly, just enough. No one inside the room marked the moment, but the line had been crossed, and there was no longer any path that led back. The radio was silent. Not broken, just silent, in the way a held breath is silent. The operator watched the indicator light without blinking, waiting for it to flicker, to pulse, to reassure him that sound was still possible. It did not. He did not touch the dial again. He had already touched it, and no one spoke to fill the gap. The room had learned, finally, that words could not make this moment lighter. Chairs remained. The ledger stayed closed. The folder stayed shut. Everything that could be arranged had already been arranged. Everything that could be decided had already passed through hands without leaving fingerprints. Outside, the engine shut off. The sudden absence of its vibration made the air feel thinner, exposed. Boots stopped moving. Somewhere metal settled after being handled. The faint clink of something set down carefully, as if care still mattered. A voice called out a number, just a number, then went quiet. The clock ticked. Each second landed heavily, no longer background noise, no longer part of routine. The sound did not speed up, but it felt closer together, as if time itself had leaned in. A man reached for his watch, stopped halfway, and let his hand fall back to his side. He already knew what it would say. The light through the window dimmed slightly, not because the sun had moved, but because something had shifted between it and the glass. The shadow did not resolve into a shape. It didn't need to. The radio clicked once. Everyone looked at it. Nothing followed. The operator swallowed and kept his hands folded in his lap, fingers locked together, knuckles pale. He did not call out. He did not ask for a repeat. He waited, because waiting was the last action left that still felt permissible. The man by the doorway took a breath he had been holding without realizing it. He straightened his jacket, smoothed a crease that did not matter. His eyes remained fixed forward, unblinking, as if he were trying to see through walls, through distance, through the thin veil of calm that still pretended to exist. No one sat down. No one stood up. The room had reached a state where movement felt inappropriate, almost disrespectful, as though whatever came next deserved stillness. Far away, something shifted. This time it carried intention, not sound, intention. The kind you feel before you hear anything, before you see anything, when the body understands faster than the mind allows. The clock's second hand approached the 12. No one counted. No one spoke. The hand reached the mark, and the room remained exactly as it was, poised, silent, and waiting. Just before everything changed.